Welcome to Whistle Stops, a new program series from the Truman Library Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our next trip down the tracks. I'm Cassie Pekarsky, Director of Strategic Initiatives and host for our journey through the all-new permanent exhibition at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum after a spectacular $29 million renovation. At every stop along the route, this series will provide you with special access to the fascinating galleries, artifacts, films, and stories inside. Now, before I give the all aboard, I'd like to give a quick thank you to our generous Whistle Stop series sponsor, Black & Veatch. The privately funded Truman Library Institute proudly supports Harry Truman's legacy in partnership with the Truman Presidential Library Museum in a variety of impactful ways. For more information about the important work we do, please visit trumanlibraryinstitute.org. While you're there, you can also watch all of our earlier Whistle Stops on the past events recording page or on the Institute's YouTube channel. There, our guest conductors will guide you through the museum's immersive introduction film, Truman's formative years in the first room of the Plow to Politics Gallery, and his journey to the Western Front of World War I. Today, we're going to stop in Kansas City in the 1920s. Truman has returned home from the war, married Bess Wallace, and started a business with his war buddy, Eddie Jacobson. In the next room, the Plow to Politics Gallery, visitors can see the Truman's wedding invitation and explore more about the Truman and Jacobson haberdashery in an interactive recreation of the store. There are also several interactives to explore what Truman did after the haberdashery closed, but I will leave those details to today's conductor. Now, to navigate us through the complex party politics of 1920s and 30s Kansas City is John Herron. John was named director of the Kansas City Public Library in 2020, following a dynamic 17-year tenure at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, that saw him arrive as an assistant history professor and rise to associate vice provost for innovation and interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He's co-editor of Wide Open Town, Kansas City in the Pendergast Era, and he probably doesn't know this, but he has the honor of being one of the stars of the Truman Library Institute's last in-person public program before the pandemic began. It was a wonderful evening that celebrated the 75th anniversary of Truman becoming vice president and, of course, his friend Tom Pendergast. It's a pleasure to have you back with us today, John.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Cassie just mentioned, before coming to the library, I had a career at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. My office was in Schofield Hall, the original campus building, where from my window on the third floor, I could look down on a small courtyard and an expanding campus green to see the exact spot where in the early summer of 1945, Harry Truman received an honorary degree from the university where he studied, but did not graduate more than 2 decades earlier. It was a particularly heady time for Truman. This trip to his hometown was squeezed between an appointment in San Francisco, where he signed the United Nations Charter, and the momentous Potsdam Conference in Europe, where he would meet with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Well, during this visit to Kansas City, Truman remarked, "When I come to Jackson County, I can't realize that I am the president of the United States. I feel like I'm just one of your fellow citizens. I see the same faces. I try to talk to the same people." Well, some of those same faces and same people included former military buddies, old business partners, and of course, members of Kansas City's famous Pendergast political machine. The story of machine politics in this town is well known, but briefly, during the early 20th century, the city was controlled by the expanding Democratic Organization of Jackson County, the official name for the machine. A dizzying array of business connections, including beverage and construction contractors, provide a financial base from which the machine entered city, county, and then state politics. The Pendergasts, first the elder brother Jim, and then younger brother Tom, controlled the city manager's office and from there, city council. They handpicked the mayor as well as every other key office in City Hall. It was old-fashioned saloon politics, although that term underestimates the political shrewdness of the family machine. Jim was an alderman who, for nearly 2 decades, reached out to his fellow Irish Catholics, and then after his death in 1911, brother Tom, also known as Boss Tom, took over, offering to feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and provide thousands of jobs, right? That is the key to the success of any machine. The political boss was a means to greater enfranchisement and, importantly, a source of patronage. Those they helped repaid the Pendergasts, as the cliche goes, by voting early and voting often. Such unique civic access allowed the machine to pass a major bond issue that, among its expected benefits, allowed the machine to control numerous city projects. Their power increased throughout the decades, so that by the early 1930s, a Pendergast ally sat in the governor's chair. The State House in Jefferson City was nicknamed Uncle Tom's Cabin. Numerous statewide elected officials owed their position directly to the machine. And for the first time in more than 5 decades, Kansas City was granted home rule, meaning control of the police force, something our current mayor wishes he probably had today. With the police controlled by City Hall, Pendergast expanded operations, engineered an electoral sweep for the Democrats in 1932, FDR's big landslide year, and took on an air of invincibility. Well, the characteristics of the urban machine in Kansas City would be familiar to anyone with even a passing knowledge of machines in New York or Chicago. With income derived from vice operations, the gambling and prostitution and alcohol forming a kind of unholy trinity, especially, I guess, when combined together, joined with inflated profits from construction projects, the Pendergast machine was awash in cash. The phrase most often associated this period in local history is that thanks to the machine, Kansas City was a wide open town. You're looking at a street scene from downtown Kansas City. This is Walnut Street, right after the turn of the century. And again, there's a level of activity in Kansas City that belies its size. It was much more active thanks to the machine than anybody could acknowledge. And this wide open town was, by almost every measure, Kansas City was. With its heartland location, its mild manners, its expansive suburbs, Kansas City has been stigmatized as generic flyover country. But during the 4 decades of machine rule, the city jumped to a jazz beat. Mob violence, infighting, a little bit of hubris on the part of the machine, and especially the rise of a political reform impulse in America would eventually end Pendergast corruption in 1940. But the impact of the machine on Kansas City was impressive. Well, our interest this afternoon is not so much on the legacy of the Pendergasts, but on the connection to Harry Truman. And his first encounter to this family came during World War I. Now, this sounds like an obvious statement, but the war would have a major influence on Truman's life. The only president to see combat during the First World War, Truman, who was too old for the draft, enlisted in 1917. If you tuned into the last Whistle Stop program, you heard how the war experience helped Truman discover and develop leadership qualities he probably didn't know he had. But remember, in World War I, local men enlisted and then served together. Army practice also allowed those home units to elect their own officers. Truman was elected lieutenant for one of the 6 batteries that was mobilized for the war. Each of those batteries was made up of recruits mostly from Kansas City. In 1918, he was promoted again, captain this time, and just as significantly to our discussion, he continued to meet soldiers from across Kansas City, including, in his words, becoming very well acquainted with young Jim. Next slide, Cassie, please. What we're going to see is on your right, that's Truman's outfit in Camp Donovan, Oklahoma. On the left is Harry Truman and James Pendergast. Well, young Jim was Lieutenant James M. Pendergast, Boss Tom's nephew. Well, the coda to this war story concludes with a return home in 1919, a business partner with once again, another old Army friend that by 1921 was struggling. Cassie, let's see the next picture. What you see here is Truman's haberdashery, which again, it was something a business he had started with an old Army friend. And by 1921, this business was struggling. A visit that summer from Jim Pendergast and his father, Mike, also known as MJ, to Truman's failing business, inquiring about his interest in a job of politics would lead to the next chapter in his life. Once again, in Truman's words, Jim Pendergast brought his father, MJ, to see me at the little store Eddie Jacobson and I were operating. If those of you who are familiar with downtown Kansas City, it's on 12th Street, just a couple blocks from where I now sit in downtown. MJ asked me if I would consider the nomination to the county court from the Eastern District. In classic Truman understatement, he replied, I would. So in the war, Truman garnered a significant political base, including the men with whom he served who proved incredibly loyal for decades. There's a great photo in the Truman Library of his inaugural parade in 1949, surrounded by the the surviving members of his World War I battery. So he gains all these strong supporters who were his combat in arms in World War I, but also he gains the connection to the Pendergast machine. That machine, that family supported him throughout his rise through political ranks. Well, at the risk of oversimplification, in post-war Kansas City, the Pendergasts approached Truman as part of a calculated political strategy. Boss Tom was, as I mentioned, Irish and Catholic. And even in a town that had large populations of both, that was still a little bit of a political liability. Truman, by contrast, was Baptist, a Protestant in a deep sea of Protestants. He also had city experience, but he hailed from eastern Jackson County, so he could easily talk farming with farmers. He was a Mason, with all the fraternal connections included. He was an Army hero, and not to be overlooked, he had a reputation for honesty and character. Boss Tom needed as much of both of those as he could possibly acquire. That the Pendergasts approached Truman, and not the other way around, is frequently mentioned by Truman defenders. But this relationship was far more important and far more impactful than many assume. As Truman admitted, quote, I went into business all enthusiastic. I lost all I had and all I could borrow. Mike Pendergast picked me up and put me in politics, and I have been lucky. Later, Truman would speak of Mike and admit, I loved him as I did my own daddy. Well, the position the Pendergasts offered was as a judge in Jackson County. You can see the political campaign poster there. It's not a judicial appointment, but an administrative one. Think of it as a kind of politically significant county commissioner. There were 3 judges on the court, one representing Kansas City proper, one the eastern countryside, and a presiding judge. And together, they controlled county monies, hiring employees in the hundreds and awarding contracts in the millions. It is no wonder why the machine was interested in this position. Truman is elected to office in 1923, 1924. He was not reelected, but he stayed in contact with the Pendergasts, and in 1927, this time with Boss Tom's renewed endorsement, Truman comes back, he's elected presiding judge. It's a position he holds until 1934. Next slide, Cassie. By all accounts, Truman performed well in the position, and you can see he's here at a dedication to the Jackson County Courthouse, one of these big projects that he oversaw. He did well as a county judge, and equally significant, despite the connection to the machine, he appeared removed from corruption. As presiding judge, Truman once wrote, "The boss wanted me to give a lot of crooked contractors the inside, and I couldn't." Later, Truman stated, "Boss Tom never asked him to do anything dishonest," and quote, "That's the God's honest truth," he concluded. "I did my job the way I thought it should be done, and he never interfered." Well, let's be clear. That may be true or true enough, but that's not the same thing as saying Truman did not have to support unethical deals or no-show work contracts or financial corruption, because he did. We know how he felt about that because Truman wrote about it a lot. And he was more than a little angry, but he also knew that this is how business was conducted in Kansas City. At one point, Truman wrote in a private diary, "I wonder if I did right to put a lot of no-account sons of bitches on the payroll and pay other sons of bitches more money for supplies than they were worth." Well, the operative phrase being there, sons of bitches, like we know what he's thinking. He used all kinds of gymnastics to justify such decisions. At one time, once again, asking himself in these private diaries, am I a fool or an ethical giant? Am I just a crook to compromise in order to get the job done? Well, looking for an answer from no one in particular, he concluded, "You judge, I can't." Well, Truman came by this angst honestly, but he knew that he needed the machine. How much the machine needed him was more of an open question. As he approached the end of his term on the county court, he was closing in on 50. Prospects for his post-political career looked uncertain at best. He made it known to Boss Tom that he was interested in the nomination for governor in 1932. Pendergast selected another candidate. He thought about Congress. Here again, Pendergast had other ideas. A number of city positions remained of interest to Harry Truman, especially the job of collector. Pendergast gave that position to William Kemper, still a well-known name here in Kansas City. But without the boss's support, there was not a great deal more Truman could do in politics. So the early 1930s were anxious years, to be sure, for Harry and his political future. As it turned out, his trepidation, however sincere, was relatively short-lived. In a 1933 letter to his wife, Bess, Truman confided, "I had a fine talk with TJ yesterday, Boss Tom, and I am still on top." Well, on top might have been a little bit of a stretch, because in truth, Truman's political future remained at least a little cloudy. But it was in the early summer of 1934 where his old friend, Jim Pendergast, once again rescued him. He reached out to let him know that the boss was interested in Truman for a position in the United States Senate. Now, Truman was not the boss's first choice. He was not the second choice, nor was he the third choice. But perhaps it doesn't matter, because in the end, the machine went to work. The primary for the Senate election that year was a three-way race. And once again, in Missouri politics in the 1930s, the primary for the Democrats is what mattered. And in this three-way race, Truman was in a very familiar position. Last, he was in the rear. But the machine engineered an aggressive campaign, pulling Truman through an exhausting tour of the state with an equally enthusiastic effort to get voters to the polls. In this election year, in Jackson County, for example, Truman received more than 120,000 votes. The runner-up, 1,200. Again, 120,000 to 1,200. You can see where some of his electoral victories came from. Only a few short months after he expressed worry that his political career was over, and rightly so, he was now the junior senator from the state of Missouri. It must have been a wild ride. Leaving little doubt of his loyalties, Truman hung a picture of Boss Tom in the reception area of his Senate office. And Cassie, I think we have a photograph of that as well. Oh, there we go. There's Truman running for senator. And you can see on the right in the hat, smiling boss Tom. And there you go. Truman in his office. You can see photographs, the photograph on the far left. Some of those are hard to see. You can see the portraits of friends and supporters. The photograph on the far left in the middle is boss Tom. Well, Senator Truman's early experiences in DC were not great. He was timid when facing the Washington bureaucracy. He was, after all, a country boy in the Senate. And of course, the Pendergast cloud continued, especially as the power of the machine wavered. In the mid-1930s, boss Tom's health began to decline just as his gambling debts mounted. Boss Tom had a reputation for being a teetotaler, a family man. Again, he had all these virtuous qualities, but he was a crazy gambler. The estimates on the amount of money he lost in gambling vary depending on what scholar you look at, but in the millions, boss Tom bet on horse racing in particular. Well, an insurance scam in 1935, complete with bribes that were not reported as income, right, mistake number one, began the process of taking down the machine. In 1939, boss Tom pleaded guilty to tax evasion and received a prison sentence. With Pendergast in Leavenworth, Truman was at a low ebb in his political career. He spoke out against the investigation, calling it partisan, going so far as to disagree with the White House on the issue, but all that did was complicate his reputation. He stated publicly that the case against Tom Pendergast was the result of what he called political animus, and reaffirmed that boss Tom, quote, has been a friend to me when I needed it. I'm not one to desert a ship when it starts to go down. Well, that's an admirable defense to be sure, but his political opponents smelled blood. In Washington, he was known, one Truman scholar wrote, quote, as the gentleman from Pendergast, the office boy, the bellhop, the one with calluses on his ears, the lackey, the fraud, a rubber stamp, right? None of those are flattering. Yet even his political detractors, including one of the attorneys that prosecuted the boss Tom case, would admit, quote, that at no time did the finger of suspicion ever point in the direction of Harry Truman. Well, that would be maybe that would be a small consolation only, because now it's 1940, and without boss Tom's support, and seemingly no White House support, Truman was up for re-election. And reflecting the conventional wisdom, running again seemed like political suicide. Truman was up against a well-financed, very popular, very dynamic candidate. His name was Lloyd Stark, governor of Missouri, who at one point was a pro-Pendergast politician himself. But in 1940, he is making no excuse for the machine, stating during one campaign stop that, quote, the decent, God-fearing, law-abiding citizens of Missouri know Truman for what he is, a fraudulent United States senator, elected by ghost votes, whose entire record in public office has been devoted to one purpose alone, and that is to the service of the corrupt master who put him in power. At another campaign stop, Stark called the machine a greedy, rapacious gang of plunderers and corruptionists. The main newspaper across the state in St. Louis, the Post-Dispatch, was equal parts scathing, and I guess we can call it creative, when they declared, quote, Harry Truman, the erstwhile ambassador in Washington of the defunct Principality of Pendergastia, is back home appraising his chances of being reelected to the Senate. They are nil. He is a dead cock in the pit. It's like, sheesh, like things are rough for Truman in 1940. Well, despite this bleak forecast, spoiler alert, we know how the story actually turns out. It was an extremely close vote. Truman would win by less than 8,000 votes out of more than 660,000 cast. There are a few reasons why. He was aided by the entrance of a third candidate who took votes away from Stark and not him. His Democratic friends in the Senate rallied to his banner. He was always popular with other senators. There was a voting bloc in St. Louis that proved remarkably strong for Truman, thanks to some behind-the-scene deals. There was the farm vote, where Truman always did well. But not to be overlooked, there was also the work of the Pendergasts, especially Jim and whatever remained of the machine. Harry Truman would carry Jackson County by more than 20,000 votes, aided in large part by the votes of African Americans who were generally pro-machine. That was a fraction of his win total from 1934, but that's still a 20,000 vote margin in a county where anyone or anything associated with the machine was supposed to be dead. Well, I want to keep our focus on Pendergast and not spend too much time on the rest of Truman's biography. But in brief, his second term was far different from his first. Like much of the nation, his time was spent in wartime preparation, including leading a committee, the unoriginally known Truman Committee, investigating fraud and waste in wartime contracts. By 1943, he was a leading liberal in the Democratic Party, a much sought-after speaker, perhaps unexpected since he was never a terrific orator, and chief proponent of the Wilsonian worldview, especially to a world now at war. And by 1944, he was also an increasingly popular choice for vice president. Cassie, next slide, please. I think what we're going to see here, yes, a cartoon describing the departing Henry Wallace. You can see him leaving the stage and wishing good luck to Harry. Well, in the campaign that year, Truman was subject to heavy criticism, including time-worn attacks that he was nothing more than a provincial rube who owed everything to the corrupt Pendergast machine. Well, in the end, it didn't really matter, right? The vice presidential race, as we know today, is always a distant second. And he assumes office when FDR is reelected once again. Well, perhaps we can end our conversation is here with this final photo on the right. The date of this photo is January 29th, 1945. Right? On the right, we see now Vice President Harry Truman, and with him, shaking hands, is James Pendergast. This is moments after Boss Tom's funeral. Truman had been vice president for a hot minute, just over a week, when he commandeered an Air Force bomber and flew to Kansas City to attend the funeral. His critics saw this pilgrimage as an outrage that reaffirmed his loyalty to a crooked machine, underscored his status as a hack. Honoring the memory of a convicted criminal was inappropriate behavior for a sitting vice president, many noted, a criticism that would linger against him for years. Well, Truman's response was very straightforward, almost similar to what happened during the initial Boss Tom trial. He was always my friend, and I have always been his. I never deserted him when he needed friends. Many for whom he'd done much more than he ever did for me ran out on him when the going was tough. I didn't do that. Right? You can see much of Harry Truman in that comment. The importance of commitment, of bond, of loyalty, of, I think we can probably fair to say, of Midwestern values. Well, the bigger question is why any of this matters. Of the many things to discuss when thinking about the career of Harry Truman, why think about his connection to the Pendergasts? Well, without too much hyperbole or exaggeration, we can probably look to what happened in Kansas City and see that together, Truman and the machine helped create the Democratic Party as we now know, certainly in the Midwest and even to some degree nationally. That is, a liberal, tolerant, heavily urban, ethnically diverse political party. Long before the New Deal ever existed, Kansas City's machine helped put together the basic elements of a political coalition that, when it appeared on the national stage, delivered the presidency to Franklin Roosevelt. Practical and non-ideological, it was socialism, Kansas City style, offering justice, cheap drinks, and public works for all, regardless of class, creed, or color, especially if all you had to do was vote the straight Democratic ticket. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, John. If you want to learn more, be sure to pick up John's book, Wide Open Town, Kansas City in the Pendergast Era. I'm sure you can get it at your local bookstore or pick up a copy at the Kansas City Public Library. Now, as presiding judge of Jackson County, Truman's financial discipline and passion for engineering resulted in the success of two large projects: building and remodeling the county's courthouses and bringing paved roads within 2.5 miles of every county farm. Now, to ensure the success of the latter, he formed an influential partnership that turned into a lifelong friendship, even across party lines. Join us for our next stop on November 22nd as we take a deep dive into the story of Harry Truman and Tom Beach. You can find information about future installments of this series, as well as other interesting programs, by signing up for our email newsletter at trumanlibraryinstitute.org and following the Truman Library Institute on Facebook. Speaking of interesting programs, our next event is the much anticipated Bennett Forum on the Presidency. At a critical and chaotic time in global history, the 15th annual Howard and Virginia Bennett Forum on the Presidency offers an essential conversation on the state and future of our democracy. The forum will feature Heather Cox Richardson, creator of the massively popular nightly newsletter, Letters from an American, and the legendary Bill Moyers. This year's live streaming event is being offered exclusively to Truman Library Institute members. Learn more about becoming a member to participate in the special event and to receive free and unlimited admission to the Truman Library and all the presidential libraries operated by the National Archives, with a donation starting at $35 that can be made at trumanlibraryinstitute.org/join. President Truman once said, "Voting is not only a right, it's a duty, a serious patriotic duty." And I hope that every eligible voter in the United States will go to the polls and make certain that his family and his neighbors go to the polls too. On Truman's behalf, I encourage everyone to exercise your patriotic duty today if you have not already, and vote in your local election. And looky there, we've arrived at the station and it's time to just disembark, just in time to go vote before the polls close. We look forward to having you aboard again soon. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.